Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Top 3 Security Enhancements in XenApp and XenDesktop 7.15 LTSR. My name is Sarah Queen, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for our services portfolio here at Citrix. In today's session, our Citrix consulting team will discuss security capabilities and use cases of the LTSR release and cover practical recommendations and lessons learned from recent engagements in the field. We will then close with our consulting services offerings that are available to support your migration should you need it. Before we go into the presentation, let me quickly review a few housekeeping details. We will have a live Q&A session toward the end of today's event, and you're welcome to submit your questions during the presentation. Simply type your question into the Ask a Question window and click Submit. Also, we are recording this event, and the on-demand version will be available from the same link that you used to join today. So feel free to come back, watch the archive, or share it with your colleagues. And finally, the slides are available for download from the Event Resources tab located along the top of the interface. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'll hand it over now to Louis Climaco, Services Relationship Manager on our Americas Professional Services team. Louis?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good day, everyone. Well, as Sarah mentioned, this time we'll present some in-depth security scenarios that are enabled through LTSR 7.15. Doug and myself, we both belong to the professional services team, and well, we're here to talk about the latest LTSR release and the relevance to some specific security scenarios. What we see out there in the field, some examples of work that we have done in this area with some of our valued customers. My role at Citrix as SRM is to understand the business requirements, the challenges, the expected outcome from our platform, such as to identify timelines, work effort, risk, and resources required from our consulting services team to fulfill those requirements and get you the best value for your investment on Citrix technologies. Doug, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Louis. Hello, everyone. My name is Doug Demskis. I'm the lead architect with Citrix Consulting, and my primary role is to develop the strategies that your organization needs to perform your business goals and make sure that the technology is the right fit for what we're trying to do.
All right, so here's the agenda that we have for today. The main purpose of this session is to give you a perspective of some of the security aspects that come along with the last LTSR, get you visibility of lessons learned, design considerations, gotchas for some of the scenarios. Hopefully, you'll find these useful and apply it to your environment. So we'll start by providing a couple of minutes to get a background on LTSR in general. What are the changes compared to the previous one, the 7.6 version? And after that, we'll dive right into the 3 security cases that are naturally enabled by LTSR. The first being the Federated Authentication Services, FAST for short, which is a really, really exciting topic for a lot of organizations these days, as it allows them to provide secure, federated access to resources from a wide array of account types. Think, Google, Okta, Ping, etc. The second one we'll discuss the transformer scenario, which also has raised a lot of noise on customers. It basically allows to transform a regular desktop into a lockdown, single-purpose endpoint, which is something that is very sought after by a lot of organizations. And we'll finalize with XenServer 7 and Bitdefender, which was proven to be a great tool to provide in-depth security to scenarios such as PCI or Swift, for example. So we'll chat about these and finalize with a slide on how we can help, and obviously the Q&A as well. So long-term service release LTSR for XenApp and XenDesktop enable enterprises to retain a particular release for an extended period of time while receiving minor updates and provide fixes, typically void of new functionality. These provide customers with greater predictability and simplified ongoing maintenance. To a very high level, the benefits that we see on the LTSR include the extended life cycle, which is, for each LTSR the clock restarts, giving you 5 years of mainstream support and 5 years of extended support, which is 10 years total. Another item is the predictable maintenance. On a regular schedule, Citrix will release community updates for each LTSR. These updates will typically, contain just the fixes for that releases without the new features to simplify ongoing maintenance. And obviously, another component is the TCO, right? The reduced IT costs. So by opting to implement LTSR, you're going to have access to the highest quality releases with the most predictable maintenance schedule to streamline your management efforts, so you can eventually lower your TCO. Citrix is committed to making the technology accessible to everyone. We design and engineer our apps and desktop virtualization products with a focus on improved usability and accessibility for all customers with or without disability. Citrix has evaluated 715 LTSR conformance with the Section 508 accessibility standards and publicly documented the results. By conducting this assessment and posting the results on Citrix.com, XenApp and XenDesktop 715 LTSR now meets the 508 compliance requirements for adoption within U.S. federal agencies. Another, huge landmark is the FIPS 140-2 compliance, which is required for procurement of IT systems for the U.S. federal government. It is also mandatory for U.S. government contractors and also for U.S. state and local government where projects are spending federal money. To accelerate the adoption and upgrade of, to 715 LTSR, Citrix has completed our FIPS testing for 715 LTSR. FIPS compliance is self-stated, subject to audit. And yet another huge item is common criteria. So Citrix is officially in evaluation with the Canadian government for common criteria certification. XenApp and XenDesktop 715 LTSR is now formally in evaluation status. We're listed as such in the Canadian government CC website. Common criteria is obviously essential for many government customers. Now, originally, XenApps and desktop releases occur once a year and contained significant updates. Many large enterprise customers needed to assess which version of the ideal to standardize their main production environment on for the coming years. On the other side, though, customers were seeking for the latest features and capabilities, and were feeling that the releases were not too soon enough. So this is how the concept of LTSR and the releases, the different releases came about. As we see on the diagram in there, where the first component is the cloud, which is always up to the latest version. They use a canary system. They use agile DevOps techniques to have an evergreening environment available to the clients. The estimated updates take place every couple of weeks, and then those updates are converted into current releases. The current releases include the latest features and are typically made available every 3 to 9 months, depending. With customers, customers are actually encouraged to update the latest CR when available. And the long-term in-service release, the LTSR, occurs less frequently. Every 2 or 3 years, that's the expectation, and are designed for customers to implement and remain on 4 years to come, up to 10 years, as I mentioned previously, with cumulative updates containing fixes made available over time. Now, an extremely important message from Citrix on LTSR 715 is in regards to the supportability of XenServer. The fact that Citrix is fully committed to support the 7.1 LTSR version of XenServer is just an attestation of, we're looking at XenServer as a critical piece of our strategy. Now, this is a busy slide. There's a myriad of updates with LTSR 715 when we compare that to 7.6 version, right? So depending on what you do in the organization, depending on how long you've been working with Citrix technologies, you may have your preferred updates, preferred feature. If you're an architect or you're doing design role, you may go with the use cases, management, or probably security features. Whereas if you do mostly kind of operations and support work, perhaps some of the user experience management new feature will get you excited, right? So for example, on this version, we have the broadest range of Microsoft OS support, ranging from 2008 R2 to 2016 on the server side, on the desktop side from Win 7 to Win 10. So we have all of them under a single LTSR. We support a complete range of hypervisor and clouds, including Xen Server, Hyper-V, vSphere, Azure, AWS, you name it, as well as NVIDIA, Intel, AMD for graphics accelerated workloads. Another huge item is its own preference because it allows organizations to efficiently utilize site resources while ensuring users always receive the most optimal connection route. Enhanced local host cache also, that technology keeps sites running even when there is no connection with the backend database, right? That connection is interrupted. Expand the reporting and alerting assist admins and help desk staff in keeping their environment running well and properly utilized. Optimize session capabilities across all scenarios through HDX with the EDT technology, enlighten data transport, provide the best possible user experience even over challenging network conditions. Visuals are automatically optimized based on type, like a video, image, text, for optimal clarity and performance through the intelligent use of UDP protocol. The expanded support for Linux includes similar Linux published applications that integrate directly within the client's desktop, as well as Linux VDI and hosted shared desktops. So, what can we say about app layering, for example, the pioneer of layering technology that dramatically simplifies applications and OS management for organizations of all sizes. So, and we could spend literally hours talking about each one of the features that we have been adding as part of LTSR 7.15. But, well, back to the topic of this webinar, Doug, I guess you already picked some of your favorites, right?
Yeah, Louis, thanks. I think I have a few, and unfortunately, I don't think we have several hours on this webinar to go ahead and dive really, really deep into each one of these, but I think if we pick a couple, the first one I'd like to talk about is federated authentication services, and we'll probably dive into some of the Windows Environment Management Transformer product, and then we'll kind of follow it up with, I think, some antivirus Bitdefender components that you mentioned that take advantage of a lot of the Xen Server components, HVI, that's actually still out there now. So I think we'll kind of get started with federated auth services, if that's okay with you.
That's perfect. Take it away, sir.
All right, sounds good. Thanks. So the way I look at federated authentication services is there's probably several different ways to look at it. First one is basically you have this really large organization that probably wants to work with a small organization, and each one has their own Active Directory. How do you kind of hook these two together without giving them a dedicated link or doing shadow accounts or all sorts of other crazy things that are needed to be able to make sure that the users have authentication in both places? You've got the other scenario where you have essentially a big company wants to have small companies' employees have access to those certain apps and data, but just the app and some of the data. But they don't want to manage things like the small employee company and make sure that they have components within their Active Directory as well. So we find that a lot of security conscious customers have lots of challenges when we start to implement FAS, and we'll go through some of these items. So you hear me say FAS and federated auth sort of in tandem. That's just sort of my general way of mixing the two, but also sort of making sure that they do mean the same thing. So federated auth services really is a means of enabling more advanced federated authentication services in effectively our older FMA architecture, but sorry, I'm going to start that over if you don't mind. So FAS is a means of enabling more advanced federated authentication scenarios in the FMA architecture. Windows does not speak federation or SAML natively. It only understands username and password or certificates. There's a challenge when customers want to leverage these technologies like ADFS or third-party identity providers like Okta or Azure AD or others that rely on strictly SAML. We previously solved this using Kerberos constrained delegation with XenApp 6.5 using the KCD or protocol translation that was available via web interface. However, XenApp and XenDesktop 7X controllers really don't understand KCD tokens, and the protocol transition service that we relied on was deprecated by Microsoft as well. So we had to develop something different, so we came up with federated authentication services to effectively replace that architecture. So FAS essentially enforces the client certificate authentication to a VDA-based machine. So FAS issues user certificates to the username provided to storefront, and that storefront then takes those credentials and authenticates them and the user to the VDA. Therefore, many configuration requirements are similar to those of smart card-based authentication, for example, configuring trust requests that are sent to the XMS service. So there's several reasons to utilize federated auth. So you have mergers and acquisitions, partners and contractors, multi-tenant management, SaaS applications such as Salesforce or any other ones that you might have, reducing the complexity of password use. The user really never needs to know their password except for the first time. And when do you not use FAS, right? So people have always asked, well, this sounds really good. Why didn't I just use it everywhere? Well, it's relatively complex to set up. And there are certain scenarios where if you just have standard NTLM authentication with a third-party authentication platform, such as like Secure RCA or something like that, then it's really not necessary. It really depends on the type of scenario that you're wanting to apply to the platform. So this slide here really shows a little bit about the architecture for FAS. Now, it looks relatively complicated, but there's a couple key components here. The first one being effectively the IDP or the identity provider. That's really where your identity system is going to be comprised of, and that really is connected to effectively your Active Directory via some sort of account management. Either that's going to be your CAS servers or something like that. Then you have your resource systems, which is effectively your NetScaler gateways, your federated auth services that sit there as well, your Microsoft cert services, and then the trust cert basically goes back and forth between the Active Directory. And then from there, you've got storefront, your DDCs, and your VDAs. And then if you look all the way on the very left, you'll see the receiver and the browser that are either going to talk via SAML or the logon tickets that are available to you. So in practicality, what you're looking at here is that storefront is trusted to request the AD logon credential for the user. It's a short-lived smart card class type of certificate, and it comes from the credential mapper. Credential mapper is trusted by the Microsoft certificate services to request a short-lived smart card class cert for the Active Directory user. A custom template is also utilized to provide some sort of control or lockdown features. AD is going to trust the Microsoft certificate services to issue the smart card class cert for the user logon. And the trust fabric or other sort of suitable mechanism is in place to establish the service-to-service identity and secure communications. You could optionally also have a credential mapper that's able to cross-check SAML tokens issued by effectively the IDP as well. Now, during runtime, you've got a receiver that's going to use a logon ticket, talk to the gateway. That gateway will then go ahead and send traffic over to the IDP, effectively rendering the certificate sent over to the federated authentication service. That service on behalf of the user will then talk to your Microsoft credential services. That credential service is going to send a ticket back to the federated auth service. And really the major core of the components here is between the gateway and federated auth service. You don't have to have storefront here, but it certainly helps because that's where a lot of your traffic is going to flow through. Once you have that, you can effectively sign on the user to your VDA as a single sign-on type process where the user actually never really sends their password other than to the NetScaler gateway and not through anything else. So it's sort of basically takes place of the username and password and inserts it with effectively a certificate. So we've had a customer, we've actually had several customers do this, and one of the case studies we'd like to go through is we had a customer that was effectively given an urgent requirement to separate an entire group from the rest of the company, almost like divestiture, if you will. and they were required to build a brand new domain that was going to be built inside of Azure. They leveraged Citrix Cloud for the XenApp and XenDesktop services. They added ShareFile services and XenMobile services as well, and they had Office 365 for email and Office applications. The customer wanted to ensure that the Citrix Cloud and the O365 data was never received or sent any sort of Active Directory credentials. Well, we could do that with XAML without too many issues. However, any sort of SSO to the XenApp VDAs really posed a problem. So how will we do that? Well, you'd enable federated authentication services to do so. So what we ended up doing was replacing a few components, and you'll see the architecture here. The predominant thing to look for is that basically the infrastructure sat inside of the Azure domain. The users were in Azure as well. And then you had desktops that were pretty much set in both different places. O365 sat for Exchange, and your XenDesktop controller sat in the Citrix Cloud. Any sort of user data was also set in ShareFile. So the ADFS components aren't always used to connect effectively to domains. You can use ADFS to turn explicit domain authentication into SAML, and you can send that traffic to storefront and the cloud services like O365. Citrix Cloud never really gets the real credentials. ShareFile never really gets the real credentials, and Office 365 never really gets the real credentials. The VDAs also never really get the real credentials. But for SSO to the VDA, we have to have FAS as well. So order of installation, if you wanted to try and build something like this, you would have to make sure that the Active Directory works with XenDesktop, and that the username and password has to function first before you try and turn on federated authentication services. You would add the FAS before adding any sort of federation, and then from there you would add the NetScaler and make sure that that works with LDAP. And once everything looks good, then the rest of your communication paths usually are pretty well established from there. So folks have also asked us quite a bit about, well, if we have these federated authentication services and in your diagram you only show one box, what do we do for high availability? Can we have multiple data centers? And what are the challenges that we have a tendency to find? Well, high availability is provided via multiple FAS servers, and they're currently all configured effectively independently, so there's no centralized database or shared configuration repository. It must be directly connected to storefront and the VDA machines via the Active Directory, but no load balancing or active health checking is available at the time. So what you have is basically storefront servers will be selectively, semi-randomly configuring or driving traffic into the configured list of FAS servers once it's connected. So that goes to basically really say, when you're all done, is that you have multiple sets of servers. There's an organization algorithm that basically will be held within the storefront services, and that will talk to your federated auth servers, and those are going to be talking to your Active Directory certificate services. You can also home a resource layer and a non-homed active-active type configuration as well. So in a home scenario, you would have your storefront talking to certain specific types of controllers, and then if you had a non-homed is where you had an active-active type of process where you had multiple users coming from lots of different places, and you have 2 dual data centers or even 3 or 4, and they would have this scenario where they could roam between each one. But when you got to that specific data center, you would have the users be able to contact their local credential services and not try and roam all over the place from where they originally came from. One key consideration here is that the private key operation requests from the VDA to the FAS will traverse the inter-data center link, so you have to make sure that those links are relatively good. It's not really problematic, but we haven't really tested over really heavy latent links. A lot of our customers are running effectively, MPLS type of networks where they're 5, 6, 20, 50 milliseconds or less, and we haven't really done a lot of testing for anything in the 250 milliseconds like you would expect to see in some wide area networks, let's say from the US to Europe or the APAC countries as well. So there's also a workaround for that, is that basically we're going to home the users to specific storefront server groups based upon Active Directory group membership. It does add a little bit more complexity, and it's effectively a little bit more involved from a gateway configuration. It does require a little bit more GSLB, but it does work. And I think if we're getting into that type of complex scenario, then it's something we probably want to talk to the consulting team and the architects to help you design that, because it does get a little more challenging as you end up with multiple sites moving forward. So from a high availability aspect, how do we eliminate the single points of failure? Well, the certificate authority has multiple CAs that are specified in the FAS service configuration. Your CAs are going to be used to generate certificates that are effectively selected at random. So if we have multiple CAs, we end up having multiple places to pull things from, and we're going to randomly select each one of those particular items. Windows clustering, we could certainly do that if we wanted to. The cost may not really be part of the enterprise standard components that we usually see from a licensing perspective. However, you can have different CAs that are specified on different FAS servers, as I mentioned earlier, and it really does depend upon the FAS server's availability based upon what server's up and what's going to be talking. So there is a sort of a cross-mesh type of scenario there. You can also have a CA failure. However, no mechanism is really used to bypass a failed CA. The failure is effectively at the server level. It may take up to about 20 seconds to determine whether that CA isn't up, and I'll explain that algorithm in a second. From a FAS server perspective, you would have potentially more than one. In most cases, you would want more than one, sort of in an N+1 type of scenario. And the FAS server list would be sent via and controlled via the group policy. Indexing is relatively important because you want it to perform as fast as it possibly can. And effectively, Storefront is going to be doing the rest of the work for you. So there's an algorithm that we have inside of Storefront called pick. And basically, in short, what it's going to do is generate a number based upon the user's UPN, and that's going to map to the FAS server that's in the actual configuration list. So for example, if you have 3 FAS servers, we're going to set up a block of numbers to basically say, let's say from 0 to 0.3, and from 0.3 to 0.6, and then from 0.6 to effectively 1. Each one of those blocks will provide you the address of a specific FAS server. We calculate based on the user's UPN what block of numbers that particular device would fall under for its communication path. And then from there, we would go ahead and send that communication path along. If you happen to have, let's say, for example, a algorithm that provides back an address that says it's 0.5, you would be going to the second FAS server. In the event that that second FAS server was unavailable, we would rebase the numbers again during the algorithm, and we'd make sure that we would get you to, let's say, either FAS 1 or FAS 3, whichever one happened to be available. So you do have this concept of high availability from that perspective, where you can configure an N+1 or multiple types of FAS servers if you should choose to use them. The Storefront VDA and FAS machines all do require a list of the FAS services. So most configuration work is really done via the group policy, which for FAS, it's either ADMX or ADML templates are provided as part of the installation, including things like setting the list of the FAS services. And when we're all done, really, all Storefront VDA machines that will support FAS off will be provided by the matching list of the FAS server, again, sort of order sensitive from that perspective, but that will complete the authentication process. The FAS servers also require the list of available FAS servers in the order to populate the drop-down list of available hosts in the console. Without the setting, the FAS management console, unfortunately, will fail to connect. So if you've seen that before, that's probably one of the things you want to look into. So from a scalability consideration, a lot of folks ask, okay, this is really good, let's get it set up. What does this do from a speed perspective, and how big should the box be, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll start off by basically saying that from a speed perspective, there is a cache. As you saw in one of the diagrams earlier, basically the cache has a certificate login. It's almost as fast, effectively, as sending the password. That certificate's going to be effectively sent back and forth, and it's, for the most part, almost at wire speed. The certificate generation takes about a second for 2K keys if you're going to use those. So that's generating the certificate coming directly from the CA that's sitting in your AD tree or your IDP at that point. The certificates are automatically cached for reuse. They're cached by default for a week. That is tunable. If we wanted to shorten them, we certainly can. A lot of our customers leave them at a week. I have had some that when you talk to the CISOs at the organizations, they want them a little bit shorter, so we can make them shorter. There is an additional load put on the servers while doing that because there is essentially a recycling mechanism that's used, but it doesn't really change much. You just have to make sure that you scale your server accordingly. The load on the CA is effectively pretty modest. You can configure the CA not to keep the certificate. So if you choose to just generate the certificate and not actually keep it, you can certainly do that. Most of the cases we have sort of this concept of deleting occasionally and backing up the CA to trigger sort of space reclaim, because we don't want that CA to be really, really big. As you can imagine, if we have, let's say, a 20,000 seat organization that is constantly issuing certificates, we're going to fill up the drives pretty quickly on that CA. We're also going to make sure that it doesn't fall over in the process. So we want to make sure that we are constantly keeping track of the space that's available. So we do have a mechanism to handle that. The load on the federated auth server is relatively modest when utilizing the cached certificate. You can also pre-generate those certificates as well. So if you want to automate this, you certainly can go ahead and do that with PowerShell. A lot of our customers are going down that path as well, where they're looking to kind of configure most of this via scripts instead of trying to click 100 buttons as we build the configuration. The load on the FAS server is significant when we're generating the certificates. We do have quite a bit of CPU that's required and taken up when we're trying to generate that cert. So in that case, we do recommend that 1 to 2 FAS servers are available for each storefront server. And we also recommend a dedicated CA server that's used by FAS. So for about 10,000 users or less, FAS server with about 4 CPUs should be sufficient. You'll have a minimum of about 1 FAS server with about 8 vCPUs. That'll do roughly about 25,000 users. If all users are expected to be able to log on under effectively what's called a cold start, or no pre-staged certificates. And we can do that roughly in about 60 to 90 minutes. A single FAS server can handle about less than 50,000 users under a warm start, or you would have a pre-staged condition. So as you can see, a single FAS box will do about, let's say, roughly 50,000 users when they're all cached and running. So the load on those particular boxes at scale is actually quite good over time. So I would suggest once everything's running, we don't need a ton of those servers. It's just a matter of making sure that we've got them during the cold start process, where we would be onboarding a lot of users, or in the scenario where we had to restart some of the devices, or there was an issue or an outage, and we had to effectively scale for mass recycling or new requests coming in from those particular devices to make sure that really we have the proper load and we don't cause a slowdown for any specific reason. I think I kind of covered some of this already, but it's here in print for you, is that you'll have effectively 4 FAS servers and 2 CA servers, all with about 8 CPUs each. You log in. In this case, if you build something that big, you can get about 200,000 users under effectively lab conditions. What does that mean? It means that we evenly staggered them, and that was sort of what we did from a testing perspective. In a cold start period, if you're looking something between 60 to 90 minutes, you'll see somewhere in the order of, like, from a CA perspective, the usage on the CPU is going to be about 7% with 2 8-way boxes. So it's relatively minimal in what it's going to do. I think the key really is under normal conditions is looking at things like the warm start period in about 25 to 30 minutes. And what does that really mean? It means your logon period for a lot of users would be staged within a small group of time, and then your FAS CPU usage would be about 10%. If we went with 4 servers using 8 CPUs. So there's effectively negligible type of CA CPU usage seen during that scenario where it's a warm start. I think when you do a cold start, it's more that the CA gets hit. But it's just something to kind of note that the boxes do require a good amount of CPU cycles to be able to get these done in a very timely manner. And that will kind of drive what you choose to put in place. Now, you can certainly make these boxes a little bit smaller. Just expect that your processes and effectively the amount of load that's placed on the machine would be a little bit higher, or you would not get as many users into the platform in a certain period of time. It depends on what your goals are, and that will drive effectively how much information or how big you need to actually build out the machine would need to be. So there are some security considerations when looking at FAS. You have something called an RA private key, and that's basically the master key to everything. If we lose that key, then the whole system effectively is compromised. So we want to make sure that that key is held pretty closely. We want to secure the FAS services like they are domain controllers. So we want to apply the normal lockdowns, reduce things like command prompts, that kind of stuff. Make sure that only certain users have access to the platform and not everyone. This also allows storefront to effectively have a bit of a greater power, right? It's going to control effectively where those connections are going to go to the FAS services, so you want to make sure that that is effectively secured as well, since it is going to route traffic a little bit more readily than we have natively. In this case, we also want to leverage any sort of ACLs that we have, and there are FAS rules that are available to effectively limit the scope of access, so basically lock down the box with ACLs. And remember that you can modify the default ARC certificate templates as well. So if you wanted to change the type of certificate that's available, you certainly can go ahead and do that. Usually it's something we don't do. We kind of usually set it right the first time, and we don't have to mess with it after that. So there are some implementation considerations that we've bumped into in the field when we configure firewalls that they can be a little bit more complicated when there's a lot of different zones. So if we have, like the scenario where we had earlier, we had multiple types of zones being into O365, into Azure, into the local on-prem site, that the firewalls do get a little more complicated. And there's a bit of a list of them just to give you a rough idea if we had multiple types of sites. From an administrator account perspective, it can be difficult to get domain admins or enterprise admins to work with the Microsoft CA. In some cases, that's held by a different group altogether in most large enterprises. And it does take time to get that pushed through, and a lot of times you got to talk with the CISOs and different folks within the AD team, and a lot of times even just the domain admin doesn't have access to the CA as well. More often than not, that you have the requirement for interactive logons for each one of these accounts within the PAS machine. As soon as we start mentioning that to a lot of the other team members, we find that there's a sort of a brick wall that's put up, and it takes a little bit of a while to discuss what it takes to get that environment stood up and how it works. We go back to the diagrams and we show everybody pretty much the path between the two. And they start to realize that it's not as bad as it looks at first, and then they're a little more apt to speak with you. But it is something that's going to take some time to get worked through. From a solution perspective, you can have certain configurations from FAS that are done manually. You don't have to do everything from a click perspective, but you'd want to run effectively some elevated commands first, and then use the psexec PowerShell commands to set up those types of accounts. You'll see them there. It's basically psexec -i -h at the same time for utilizing the FAS configuration tool. So in some cases, you can't add FAS GPOs for VDAs or storefront. If that's the case, you can use local policies, but we really don't recommend you do that in production. We want to make sure that you do have those particular configurations set up without requiring the use of non-local policies. So we've had some challenges, obviously, when working with sort of complicated customers. You have the potential for the configuration tool in FAS to be relatively slow. One of the most general possible causes for that is missing the enterprise CA. Usually we want to remove the legacy CA servers, make sure we have the right one. A lot of times we're talking to an old one, and you can read through the list in sort of eDocs, but there's different types of CAs that we do support. And in some cases, you can, again, configure the certain FAS connections and tasks manually via PowerShell. We've had some instances where we also don't want to close the browser after logout. So there's certain kiosk types of examples where we don't want to do that. There is a key that we can actually tune that if we choose to. And again, there's sort of a related security consideration where we're either potentially logging out or timing out doesn't really expire the SAML token, and some folks don't necessarily like that. So a lot of times we want to go and make sure we close or log out that browser once the connection is made. There's also multiple ways to configure ADFS. Not all SAML bindings may work in all situations, so there's a few listed here on the slide, but just note that it does support multiple options. Each one has its own little set of constraints, which I don't want to dig into just yet due to time, but there are several ways that we can do it, but just kind of know that going forward, and it does change a little bit on how we're going to make sure that the recommendations from an architecture perspective are valid. So something you definitely want to make sure that you understand how that SAML binding is being made within your organization moving forward. So from a troubleshooting perspective, a couple things that we see quite a bit is that we want to make sure that the FAS GPO list is consistent everywhere, that GPO does assign numbers which must match across the board, so we have to make sure that those are consistent. Any sort of Server 2003 era AD or CA is pretty much going to hit some problems, very likely not to support the SHA-2 types of certificates. So I don't see too many customers having that issue, but just know that if you have a legacy type of environment, it's probably going to need to be upgraded to support FAS as well. Checking things like firewall ports to the CA, that's usually pretty important as well. It seems relatively common that we bump into challenges there. Things like your check CRLs and your AIA distribution points are really make sure that those are accessible to Active Directory controllers and the VDAs, and that the NT-auth store is correct. There's a tool that will help you to see those issues as you run into them. You can use PKI View to assist there, but that's kind of your friend when it comes to configuring some of the CRLs. Watch the size of the CA database as well. We do often automate a backup process to trigger that space reclaim. As you can imagine, if you have 10,000, 20,000 seats within the CA, that it's sending out certificates, you're going to have a certificate for each one of those users, in some cases multiples, depending on the number of CAs that you have. So we also want to make sure that we do reclaim space from the old certificates for that. There's also several event logs that are available to you from a federated auth service perspective. They're really your friend when it comes to troubleshooting this. There's a FAS log, a storefront log, VDA logs. You can also enable verbose logging from the federated auth service, and you'll see the registry keys there. There's also a link to the article that shows you sort of what all the event log messages in FAS are. That's kind of helpful to read through before you get started configuring this, because you'll probably end up digging into those event logs pretty regularly as you're setting this up. So we have some lessons learned also from the field, that things that we bumped into that had we known a lot earlier, it would have probably saved some time, to be quite honest, but we're going to share them with you as well. So conversations to really have very early on is verifying requirements with the team that's going to manage the CA. I can't stress that enough. There's usually another team that's working on the CA, and it's unlikely that you're going to have access right away. So you're going to have to discuss the architecture and traffic flows with the security team as well. You also do have to have a shadow account that matches the username that's entered in the original authentication prompt. That has to be created in the target domain for FAS to issue certificates to. So it's not like shadow accounts go away. You still need them, but you don't have all the KCD stuff that you had earlier from the older IMA architecture. This is also not done automatically. It's a general requirement for federated auth scenarios, so you do have to set up those shadow accounts. You can certainly script them in PowerShell and get them all ready, but you are going to need them. From a project perspective, infrastructure requirements may take a lot longer to satisfy than typically seen for virtualization projects. So if you're expecting that this is going to stand up in like a week or two, you may want to add a little bit more extra time to the project plan, just to make sure that you allocate for some of the complexities that this is going to add to your system. There's additional operational considerations required for the rollouts, effectively to minimize the impact of the certificate generation load. And what that really means when we're all done is that you have to stagger the implementation of or the onboarding of users into the platform in such a way that you have to make sure that we're not going to bring everybody all in at exactly the same period in time and effectively force like a logon storm, if you will. Which you can do if your systems are scaled based, as we discussed earlier. So if they're scaled properly, you can go ahead and do that. If they're not, and we're looking for more of the warm start type of scenario, we have to make sure that we do stagger those user logons appropriately.
So Doug, most of us are aware of kind of the wonderful features that the Workspace Environment Manager brings in terms of optimization, bring efficiency on the environment, but there is a kind of a quote-unquote hidden gem in terms of controlling, securing the endpoints, and we're seeing, an uptick on these for several large customers, right? So I guess is the topic of the next case, right?
Yeah, correct, Louis. We are. So we have customers that are looking at it from a perspective of trying to understand how they can turn their repurposed PC into more of a kiosk type of device, or trying to find a way to lock down the services a little bit more with some of the products either they already own via the enterprise licensing or platinum licensing, as well as trying to really just see if there's an alternative to some of the other technologies that they have out there. And that sort of brings you to the next point, which is really around the Workspace Environment Manager. And while WEM does a lot within the environment, you can lock down a lot of different items, I wanted to focus specifically on Transformer because of what it does from a security perspective. It does actually allow the users to get access to the system, but it also turns your repurposed PC effectively into a kiosk type machine, which allows you the ability to control that and lock that down a little bit more. So we have a customer that is looking to do that and actually is in the process of going through this build at scale. Well, before we talk about that, I do want to cover sort of some of the things that Workspace Environment Management does do if you're unfamiliar with them. So it does optimize things like the user experience. It allows you to control things like printers, et cetera. It does accelerate logins. It has a CPU quiescing mechanism that it has as a feature set as well. It allows you to simplify some of the administration because it's more of a general type of holistic architecture where you can control a lot of different items directly from a single set of consoles as opposed to multiple places. Can it save you money? Yeah, I guess if applied in the proper manner, you certainly can save money just from an administration standpoint, where you would make sure that things are more economy of scale where we're configuring items. So from a Transformer perspective, it basically dynamically converts that Windows PC into the high-performing thin client at that point. So it allows you to accelerate things like your VDI rollout and does simplify the type of administration that you would have available to you. So a little bit about the case study. We're working with a customer recently. It's a financial services customer that's utilizing Transformer to employ on their corporate-owned desktop machine. And what it does is it basically forces the users to leverage their XenDesktop session. Even though the user does have a regular thick OS, it has been a repurposed PC. It's been locked down. However, what the challenge has always been is how do you get the user to point directly at the website that you want them to in a way where we're not generating a lot of scripts, or we're not custom writing a bunch of items or what have you. We have this product that allows you to kind of do that automatically. So the users are going to log into the endpoint, and effectively the WEM agent is going to lock that machine down based upon the types of criteria that you ask it to lock down. And it's going to auto-launch effectively an IE landing page. That landing page is going to effectively point at your storefront services, and users can be allowed to have access to their XenDesktop or even your XenApp machine. The IE application that we're launching for this specific use case was actually a PowerShell script that checks whether or not the internal storefront servers are resolvable. If it's successful, we're going to send the users to the internal storefront site. If it's not successful, then we're going to send them to the external site, kind of giving you some additional failover processes or just really HA, and that the user can authenticate and launch their XenDesktop after they've reached to their storefront devices. We've also provided things like additional tools as well. So within that GUI, you can have multiple types of tools that you can either custom script or provide to the end user. In this case, we built a computer info script, basically allows them to have access to their PC type information if they want to know what the name of their machine is, things like that. We also allow them to connect to any sort of VPN, or in some cases actually connect to the Wi-Fi network, as we have this on a roaming case, such as like a laptop where people are roaming from building to building. It allows them to basically do their job and continue to have the WEM product work for them. So quick sample architecture here. It's relatively straightforward. In this case, from the diagram perspective, what you'll see is an active-passive type of scenario. We had multiple sets of data centers that we were working out of, but to keep things relatively simple, we had a WEM broker that was both put in the West data center and the East data center, and then our SQL database that we needed to connect to was all sitting in the primary data center, which happened to be in the West, and then we just ran effectively an active-passive type replication model over to the database on the other side. We did enable GSLB so that we pointed users based upon wherever their traffic was going to be via RTT, that they landed in the proper data center, but all traffic did eventually make it back to the West data center. And really did that just from a simplicity sake. You could certainly do them active-active if you wanted to. There is some additional scalability considerations there that I won't go into, unfortunately, today, just due to time constraints. But if it's something that you want to see, we can certainly work with you to show you what that would look like at a later point. A little bit about the actual architecture itself. There are several communication paths between the agent and the broker. There's circuit ports that are used. So there's the sync cache via WCF, and that works over port 8285. And then there is your traditional WCF components also that are going to work over 8284, and that's really from the broker to the console. That's sort of like your management port. The customer we worked with recently didn't have that port open. For some reason, it was locked down, and we fired at the console and nothing really worked correctly. So just kind of keep track of these ports, that they are available and open, so that you have an idea that you're basically working with the right ports and things aren't locked down and you're getting in your way during the installation process. So from a transformer perspective, and within WEM in general, there are lots of available settings, right? So you have things like, for example, different actions that you can take. You can lock down applications, you can control printers, network drives, registry entries, ports, user DSN files if you want to. You can also write rules against conditions where you can say things are always true, always not true, etc. You can set things like the IP, the XenDesktop site, and the computer name match. So if they match correctly, then you can allow the logins. We could set up an Active Directory site match. So if the user happens to land in the wrong place or whatever, you can lock that down so they're not trying to get to some AD that's not on your environment. You can do registry value matches, check for OS platform types, etc. And then there are environmental settings available all within WEM as well, where you have things like controlling the start menu, showing the desktop, not showing the desktop, enabling Windows Explorer or not, showing only known folders, or any sort of other HVD type tuning that's available. So from a transformer perspective, one of the things that we were controlling was the ability to control printers, what drives the user was able to connect to, things like taskbar and start button access. We also controlled from an environment what sort of desktop they got, and then whether or not they were able to enable Windows Explorer based upon things like the SmartX controls that were available. So if you looked at one of the previous slides earlier, if you were following along, you would find that this is independent of the NetScaler devices, right? So this is effectively the agent that sits on the user's endpoint device, and we pass them over to Storefront. Whether it was passing to Storefront in an internal manner or an external manner, we still had things like Smart Access on NetScaler to determine whether or not they were going through certain EPA scans and checks. So we were checking for things like antivirus, for example, in conjunction with this particular product, just to make sure that the user was really locked down to where we wanted them to go, made sure that they were forced over to go to the XenDesktop type session that we wanted them to be in. And then from there, we could control effectively the location and type of access that the user had that was really based on a set of conditions that we had defined from an operational perspective. In addition to Transformer, we also recently announced that we can extend the management capabilities of Microsoft App Locker. So if you have the need, or if you've been looking at App Locker and the whitelisting components or sort of feature set that's available, we can deploy App Locker with the Workstation Environment Management Application Security Model. This is relatively new from Citrix. This is really kind of neat because from a WEM perspective, it gives you the ability to configure multiple sets of policies where you can only really configure one for each individual type of use case that you have within App Locker. So if we wanted to use WEM in this case, so you would have your Microsoft App Locker that you can only really apply one rule to each group, so that group can only apply one rule at a time, but then you can only edit one rule at a time, and there's really no like search capability or anything like that. So what WEM does is it extends those management capabilities and solves the limitations between sort of one rule, one group kind of concept, where we can now do bulk editing, bulk assigning, and we have the ability to basically apply a rule to one or more groups. We also have the ability to search as well. So there's some extension of the platform in Microsoft's App Locker that we provide as part of the WEM suite, and it does help extend the security of XenApp and XenDesktop via that whitelisting. So it's kind of a good way to work with App Locker if it's something that you're looking at in the future. So when we look at LTSR, and specifically Xen Server 7, we have an HVI integration that we have available via Bitdefender. HVI, a hypervisor introspection engine, allows a revolutionary approach to security. It detects, protects, and remediates advanced threats, things like antivirus, malware, rootkit exploits. It's agentless. There's no need to install software in each agent guest OS. There's minimal time and effort to set it up. Only one virtual security appliance needs to be installed per host to monitor the memory of all VMs that's on the host. HVI can protect the virtual environments from today's sophisticated attacks, providing our customers with additional level of security and confidence. HVI remains isolated from the operating system. It scans memory for attack techniques instead of known patterns, as does traditional antivirus. It also protects zero-day attacks, and rootkits can't hide from the HVI as they can with traditional AV. You'll notice that you have the Citrix Xen Server control domain, DOM0, and underneath that, you'll have your compute, networking, and storage environment. That's where the Xen hypervisor is going to sit. Bitdefender is going to sit in DOM-U, effectively providing your antivirus solution to the rest of your XenDesktop or XenApp guest OSs, as you'll notice in the diagram. There's a difference between traditional antivirus and direct inspect HVI. In a traditional antivirus solution, it only protects the file system. It can't detect any in-memory attacks, such as what's common with browser vulnerabilities. As you can imagine, browsers, there's several of them. There's also lots of different types of plugins or extensions that could be downloaded and installed. Some might be questionable, some might be perfectly fine, but how do you know which ones are the good ones? Especially when you provide your users with a lot of unlimited control within a browser perspective. How do you keep track of the browser? We've noticed over time that the browsers are one of those items within the software stack that is really hard to control from any sort of perspective, security or otherwise. Within that browser, you can be attacked from inside the VM. You can run any sort of security software or any other type of software within that VM effectively runs in an uncompromised type of state. So what does that really mean? It means that you could have the traditional antivirus system basically attacked by the virus and have it turned off. Traditional AV also relies on sort of spotting any sort of pattern. It really can't spot entirely new attacks, previously undetected APTs, for example. In a direct inspect HVI platform, such as what's available in Xen Server and new to the platform, it's going to scan raw memory at the hypervisor layer. So it's going to detect, protect, and remediate the threats, sort of antivirus, malware, and any sort of rootkit exploits in that case. It protects also your guest memory. It's going to stop any sort of attack from gaining a foothold on the system because, again, it only runs in that protected space and not in the unprotected. There's no security software in the VM, so the viruses really can't compromise it. So it sits in a different space as a result of being in the HVI space. It also is going to detect and block sort of attack techniques. Those attacks can detect the platform will be able to detect sophisticated, previously undetected threats. In a hypervisor memory introspection platform, no agent is going to run inside of that VM, unlike other security solutions, as we mentioned earlier. The security appliance is going to monitor the guest memory via Xen. Both the full and the light agent, based upon antivirus, have the same problem. They're designed to combat common malware. Yet the threat of advanced malware continues to grow with exploits of zero-day vulnerabilities and kernel bugs. With Bitdefender enabled, a supported security solution is able to watch the guest memory in real time, detecting malware as it executes inside the VM. By virtue of the isolation the hypervisor provides, the security solution can no longer be attacked by the malware. In fact, the system can be and will be assumed to have been infected rather than relying on an initial clean state. In a direct inspect API, the extensions to Xen, which are all third-party security vendors, are available to protect guests from malware. Using the Intel AMD extensions, third-party security appliances can be granted access to protect the guest memory. Using an understanding of guest memory, the appliance can register rules with Xen that allow it to trap and inspect operations that are not permitted. This allows declarations like no pages of stack memory should ever be executable, or these pages of interrupt tables must be only executed and not rewritten, for example. The building block hardware supports this technology is, again, Intel's EPT. This is going to provide the acceleration required to set up notifications or traps on the critical memory systems regions made inside of the guest machine that are registered upon setup by the security appliance. The rules of the security appliance will then be created when things like invalid memory access or other types of items are made by the guest application kernel, and the hardware is going to intercept and notify the security appliance, allowing it to determine how to respond. All this relies upon the quote-unquote magic provided by the security vendor in mapping how the physical memory maps into the structures and contents of the virtual machine, and that's all enabled by the HVI. If we look at an example, when there's an exploit, it's going to be detected and blocked. So if you consider the operating system have an unprivileged and a privileged memory space, or a space in general, you'll have a kernel and a device driver sitting in the privileged space. Underneath that, you'll have guest memory, and the Direct Inspect API engine will be able to be enabled by Xen. In this case, you'll have, let's say, a Word application that's running, and that'll be talking to the guest memory. The guest memory detects that there's something going wrong, such as a virus that sits inside of Word. Somebody opened an attachment, for example. That guest memory is flagged via the security appliance under Xen and is then set to close or halt the threat that is being executed. Once the threat has been detected and cleaned, the security appliance will then allow the rest of the system to continue on as needed. In a Stack Overflow example, you have a function with overflow. You'll have effectively let's say a bug, for example, or a large payload. So you'll have valid memory, your buffer overflow, your exploit code, and this all sits inside of your heap memory. To give you a very simplified example, let's say an attacker will discover a bug in a function, which it can call when it allows an overflow to an allocated buffer. This may well have the effect of overwriting an instruction pointer that gets followed at some sort of point. The attacker could use this vulnerability by passing a long string to this function, which includes repeated addresses to some known region of heap memory, which is placed inside of the malicious code, which results in the malware actually getting run. So if in the buffer overflow it gets executed, we find that there's bad code, that code is exploited, and with protection, for example, that code will be tried to be executed in the heap memory, flagged, and actually stopped. In this case, an attempt to execute a read-write page exception was raised to the introspection engine to decide what to do next. With the Direct Inspect API, a security vendor will enable or be able to protect regions of memory, such as the heap, from allowing code to be executed. They do this by marking pages such as read-write only. When the VM attempts to execute a page as a result of the attack, the hypervisor will stop the operation from occurring and notify the introspection engine in the security appliance. At this point, the security appliance can decide how to best respond. But there's more. So how does the security VM actually see the process inside of memory? Well, the CPU has to keep a pointer to the OS kernel, and we're going to start effectively there. The kernel then keeps track of what processes are running to schedule them. And each process has a descriptor table which tells us where the actual memory is. And when it finds something it doesn't like, it will stop it based upon the set of rules that are applied. Now, you would be thinking, well, this probably is going to be a pretty big hit from a scalability perspective. What actually is the security or the scalability components that we have to be aware of? Well, we really haven't found that much. We see roughly about a 10% overhead that is required by the system and the VM, and kind of from scalability, you just don't get as many users when this is running, but it's relatively minimal. It's only about 10%. Now, evidently, there's probably cases where it's probably worse, and it depends upon what we're actually protecting. So in certain cases, if we're looking at lots of heap memory or lots of known executables or things like that, we've got a very large footprint from the user perspective, then we may see additional reduced scalability, but it's really something you're going to have to test within your environment. Now we're going to turn it over to Lewis, and Lewis is going to talk about how we can help you define some of the architectures that are needed so you can meet your business goals moving forward. Lewis?
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Doug. Really, really great information, and hopefully, we're going to have plenty of customers trying out these new features within LTSR 7.15. And just to reinforce the initial statement on this presentation, we're here to help, right? The purpose of Citrix Professional Services is to make any customer successful using Citrix technologies. And these may come from many different forms, ways. Sometimes we are just, providing guidance and counseling, feedbacks onto your plans on, whiteboarding exercises, etc. Sometimes we participate in a much more formal engagement where people on site help you get to the expected outcome out of the platform. We have the education offerings that can be adapted to your specific needs or the needs of your organization. If you are, taking the lead as a single individual or you are leading a team, we can provide options for all of them. So speaking on the security aspects, what are our offerings today? Well, we have three broad categories which map to the customer's needs, basically. The assessment, for example, is ideal for customers that want the vendor to review their environment and help them understand how they can improve on their security posture. For customers that, for example, are implementing a new environment, are upgrading and want to revisit that approach, or know they need a new approach, we can help them with a workspace security design where we explicitly and deliberately focus on security as a key driver. We have something similar, for example, for LTSR assessment and design, where we assess and design with a focus to bring you to the 715 LTSR environment. So, finally, we have use cases that we can help enable. We may help customers with implementing specific guidelines required for compliance. For example, Swift is one that is coming along really, really nicely with a lot of our financial institutions. PCI DSS, for example, GDPR is another one. Now, as it pertains to training offerings related to security, I would suggest looking at the CTX 270, which is comprised of, two components. One of them is very focused on the networking and mobility security aspects of it. It takes 3 days. The other one, 2 days securing the virtualization portions of it. You can take those components separately. You can take them as a bundle. And as always, you have multiple options to get in here. Like you can opt to kind of face-to-face with a trainer, or you can do the virtual type of engagement, all of them with hands-on labs, etc. So for those of you in the finance, healthcare, government, this I'm pretty sure can be a good tool, a good guidance on securing your current platform. There's a lot of in-depth knowledge on how to secure the virtualization platform, load balancing, HA, content switching, GSLB, etc. So, this takes us to the end of the actual presentation. So now, before we move into the Q&A, I would like to remind our audience that if you have questions for our speakers, you can submit it in the Ask a Question area of your screen. Simply type your question in the box and then hit Submit. Okay, so once I get the control of the audio, I'm gonna go across. Okay, we know we're at the top of the hour. We'll stay on for a couple of minutes. We have some questions on the line. For this Q&A period, we have Ryan McClure from our enterprise architecture team joining us in the panel as well. So let's pick a couple of questions of the queries that we have from the audience. Apologies if we don't have time to answer all of them. If there are many questions left, we can try to set up a blog or respond offline to you. So here's question one. Once we establish and go across question one, do I direct that to, I'll say, hey, Ryan, question one, or Doug, or I leave it open and you guys jump in?
I'd probably call out the person to answer it.
Yeah, okay. I'll call you, Doug, and then probably after you, Ryan could also chime in. Do you want me to give question two to Ryan?
Yeah, why not?
All right. And then,
less than 5 minutes away.
Okay.
All right.
So the presentation is not concluded. Once it has concluded, it will auto flip over. So then you guys will be live. I'll let you know when we're a minute away. Just stand by and get ready, and then you guys will be live.
Okay. And then question 3, Ryan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sorry guys, I was staying muted because it says that we're on air in the webcast thing, so I was just making sure that that wasn't actually the case.
All right.
So, yeah, I can
do. You want to take 3?
Me for questions 1 and 3, and Doug for question 2.
Okay. And
is that what we said?
Those, yeah, I probably wasn't paying attention to that, but yeah, that's fine. So you 1 and 3, Doug number 2. After number 3, well, thank you everyone for your time this morning. I appreciate your assistance, and hopefully, I mean, you're gonna have additional ideas to take full advantage of your platform. Thanks a lot. See you next time. So, or unless we have additional questions, and then what is the mechanics for you guys to let me know which one you is a good question or not, or we're gonna be, I mean, I guess chatting on the.
I think we just kind of stay silent. You type into the presenter chat that we're finished, and then they have Sarah go ahead and close it down.
Yeah, once you finish and say thank you, I will end the webcast. Just stay on the line on mute for a minute, and I will come back on and let you know when you're all clear.
Okay.
And just remember, when you're not speaking, try to keep yourself on mute because we can hear things like the keyboard and any other noises. Just remember to unmute yourself when you're ready to talk. Okay, we're just about a minute away, so everybody stand by.
Okay, so I know we are at the top of the hour, but we will stay on for a couple of minutes as I believe we have some questions on the line. For this Q&A period, we have Ryan McClure from our Enterprise Architecture team joining us as well on the panel. So let's pick a couple of the queries that we have from the audience. Apologies in advance if we don't have time to answer all of them. If there are many left, we'll try to set up a sort of a block to respond or come back offline to you. Okay, so here's one question. Once you have an established and stable LTSR 7.6 environment, how beneficial is to move to 7.15? How do I know how much effort, risk is involved on the move versus the benefits? Ryan, you wanna take this one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Louis. This is a question that we're getting quite a bit now, as you can imagine. So if you take a look at some of the feature differences between 7.15, the second LTSR, and 7.6, the first, there are some features in there that we would qualify probably as more than nice to have, right? There are some really compelling features in there, like the new local host cache and as a replacement for connection leasing, the enhancement of some of the site and zone capabilities, some of the advanced app publishing features that really can streamline manageability in the environment and fortify redundancy or resiliency. So it's definitely something to strongly consider. Obviously, any production change carries some degree of risk, but from a work effort perspective, it's not massively different than, for example, going from one CU to the next. So it's definitely something that a lot of our customers are planning for implementation, early in 2018, whether it be Q1 or first half of the year.
Awesome. Any comments on your side, Doc?
No, I think Ryan covered it pretty well. I think the other thing to add there is from a feature set perspective, you also have the new EDT protocol that is being leveraged by a bunch of other customers as well, and that kind of falls in line with wanting to upgrade in some cases for certain customers. So it's definitely worth checking out.
Excellent. I have another question here. I have a ESX as our hypervisor platform, but we have a new request for a secure browsing, and the Bitdefender HVI seems a very compelling approach. Do you see out there much mix of hypervisor? Any gotchas? Doc, you want to take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Louis. I think there is probably a really good question there is really just around the concept of mixing hypervisors, and we see that quite often. We have a lot of customers that leverage that mixed hypervisor scenario where they would use, like, let's say ESX for their databases, common infrastructure, controllers, that kind of thing. And then they look to leverage something like a Xen server at the compute level via either XenApp or XenDesktop. And really, your next step there is to leverage like Bitdefender or some sort of other HVI-based antivirus tool and the secure browser component so that you can get the ability to basically have multiple sets of hypervisors, specifically on like Xen server, for example, for the compute. We see it pretty often, surprisingly, but from a gotcha's perspective, it's really just an operational process that you have to have knowledge capital on both sets of hypervisors, and they scale a little bit differently, and there's some general just operational model things you got to watch for. But as long as the skill set's there within the organization, there's no reason not to build it that way.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Doc. One final question. Can FAS be used in a double hop ICA scenario that we all love and cherish? Ryan, you wanna take that one?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Essentially, to get this to work, the most straightforward option is that you're basically doing FAS twice. So because that initial FAS logon doesn't really have credentials for receiver to capture and rely on the SSON service with, basically you would be enabling domain pass-through on storefront. Receiver would do Kerberos silent off the storefront like it usually would in that scenario, and then FAS would happen a second time to facilitate the double hop launch. So yep, it should be something that'll work. It just requires a little bit of extra care and feeding. Excellent.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. Well, thanks everyone for your time this morning. I appreciate your assistance. And hopefully, you're going to have additional ideas as a result of this webinar to take full advantage of your investment on the Citrix platform. So we'll proceed to close the webinar. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.